Brazil should be good at basketball. They have 212 million people in population. They have athleticism. They have a deep sports culture. And unlike many countries we've talked about, Brazil has produced NBA players. They've won medals. They've beaten elite teams before. So this isn't a story about potential. It's a story about why that potential never became consistent. Because every few years, Brazil looks like it's back, and every few years, it fades again. No continuity, no sustained pipeline, no clear identity. So how did a country with all the raw ingredients for basketball success end up stuck in cycles of false starts and missed windows? To answer that, you have to go back to when Brazilian basketball actually mattered, and what went wrong after. Brazilian basketball wasn't always an afterthought. In fact, for a long time, Brazil was one of the strongest basketball nations outside Europe and the United States. They won World Cups in 1959 and 63, reached Olympic podiums, and developed a reputation for flair mixed with physicality. Brazil played with confidence, with creativity, with edge. Players like Oscar Schmidt became international icons, not just scorers, symbols of what Brazilian basketball could be. But here's the key difference between Brazil and modern basketball powers. Brazil produced players. They never built a system. Success came from talent and moments, not structure. Domestic leagues existed, but they weren't aligned with national development. Youth pipelines varied wildly by region. Coaching philosophies weren't unified. When Brazil won, it felt organic. When they lost, there was nothing underneath to stabilize them. At the federation level, long-term planning was inconsistent. Leadership changes, funding issues, and shifting priorities meant that every generation started almost from scratch. There was no mechanism to turn success into momentum. And as basketball globalized and professionalized, that flaw became fatal. Other countries were building pipelines. Brazil was still relying on individuals. That worked in the past. It doesn't anymore. Because once the game sped up and competition deepened, Brazil's lack of structure started to show everywhere, especially at home. Brazil has had professional basketball for decades. That wasn't the problem. The problem was what the league was actually built to do. Brazil's top competition, known as the NBB, has always prioritized survival, visibility, and entertainment over long-term development. Clubs needed wins, sponsors needed exposure. Young players were rarely the priority, so teams leaned on experience. Veteran Brazilians, foreign imports, short-term roster construction. From the outside, the league looked healthy. Games were competitive. Atmospheres were good, but development-wise, it stalled. Young Brazilian players struggled to get real responsibility. Minutes were limited, mistakes weren't tolerated, and without pressure minutes, growth slowed dramatically. There was also no enforced link between clubs and youth academies. Unlike Spain or Germany, Brazilian teams weren't required to invest heavily in development. Some clubs did good work locally, others did nothing. The result was inconsistency. A talented teenager in one city might get elite coaching. In another, that same player might plateau completely. The Brazilian Basketball Confederation, CBB, never fully aligned the league with national team needs. Coaching philosophies varied. Player roles at club level didn't translate cleanly to international play. So the league existed, but it didn't compound. Brazil produced professionals, not progression, and while Brazil's league stood still, the global game accelerated. Because once Brazilian players stepped outside that environment, the gap became impossible to ignore. Before you even talk about development, you have to talk about priority. And in Brazil, basketball was never the priority. Brazil is one of the world's great sports nations, but its sporting identity has always been clearly defined. Football dominates everything. Volleyball built a serious institutional presence. Even combat sports and motorsports carved out visible pathways. Basketball never did. For decades it lived in the background. Survival on occasional success, not sustained relevance. A good tournament here, a memorable player there. Enough to stay alive, never enough to take root. That matters more than talent. In countries where basketball thrives, kids see a future. They see players on TV. They see professional pathways. They see proof that choosing basketball makes sense. In Brazil, that signal has always been mixed. There has never been a consistent Brazilian NBA presence to anchor belief. The domestic league doesn't feel like a gateway to the world, and national team success has come in waves, not eras. So participation becomes uneven. Talented athletes are identified early, and many are guided toward football or volleyball instead. Basketball often becomes the second choice, something you try, not something you commit to. At the institutional level, basketball has never been treated as a strategic growth sport. Funding fluctuates, facilities vary dramatically by region, coach education lacks national standardization. The sport survives, it doesn't scale, and this creates a quiet but powerful feedback loop. Limited visibility leads to limited investment. Limited investment leads to shallow development. Shallow development reinforces low expectations. By the time players reach the elite level, basketball has already lost years of potential growth. Brazil isn't bad at basketball because the country lacks passion or athleticism. They're bad because basketball never secured the cultural position it needed to turn those advantages into a system. And once culture sets the ceiling, the type of player you produce is almost inevitable. If this video is clicking so far, hit subscribe. This channel breaks down why basketball countries with talent still fall short. Not with hot takes, but by looking at the systems underneath everything. The next chapter explains why Brazil's issues aren't about effort or passion. They're about structure, continuity, and misalignment. Alright, let's keep going. As basketball globalized, the countries that stayed relevant plugged themselves into bigger ecosystems. Brazil didn't. While Europe built interconnected leagues and the NBA became a development reference point, Brazilian basketball became largely domestic. Very few Brazilian players entered elite European academies. NCAA pathways were inconsistent. NBA integration slowed after the early 2000s. Brazil still produced occasional pros, but not a pipeline. Players like Leandro Barbosa, Nene, and Anderson Varejão reached the NBA, but they didn't open a sustained pathway behind them. They were individual successes, not system outcomes. And that distinction matters. Without a steady flow of players testing themselves abroad, Brazil lost a crucial feedback loop. Weaknesses weren't exposed early. Standards didn't rise. Domestic development stayed insulated from global demands. When Brazilian players finally faced elite competition, the adjustment was harsh. The pace was faster. The spacing was tighter. The physicality was more organized. Brazilian players weren't unathletic, they were unfamiliar with the speed of modern decision-making. There was also no strong regional pressure. Unlike European players who grew up in leagues that mirror international basketball weekly, Brazilian players often encountered elite play only during short tournaments or qualifiers. That's not enough to change habits. Countries improve when elite competition becomes routine. For Brazil, it was still occasional. As the global game continued to evolve, Brazil slowly drifted out of alignment, not because they lacked talent, but because they were connected to where the game was actually moving. Which brings us to the final internal problem: why Brazil never seems to build on its good moments long enough to matter. Brazil has never been short on moments. A strong tournament run, a surprise win over a powerhouse, a generation that looks promising. And then it resets. One of the biggest reasons is instability at the top. Brazilian basketball governance has struggled with continuity for decades. Leadership changes, shifting priorities, and inconsistent long-term planning meant that progress rarely carried over from one cycle to the next. Every new administration brought a new direction. New coaches, new player pools, new philosophies. Nothing stayed long enough to compound. At the national team level, coaching turnover prevented identity from forming. Systems changed between tournaments, roles changed. Players were asking to adapt on the fly instead of growing inside a stable framework. The lack of continuity matters more than talent. Countries that stay elite don't rebuild every cycle, they refine. Brazil rebuilt constantly, and when results dipped, the response was often short-term. Naturalized players, roster reshuffles, quick fixes aimed at qualification instead of development. Those moves helped Brazil stay competitive in the moment, but they delayed the harder work. Building a program that could survive beyond one generation, So Brazil stayed in a loop. Enough talent to compete, not enough structure to sustain. Always close, never consistent. Brazil didn't fail because it lacked players. It failed because it never allowed success to stack. Which leads to the final layer of the problem. Why basketball in Brazil never secured the cultural position it needed to support long-term growth. By the time you reach this point, Brazil's biggest problem becomes clear. They're not just inconsistent, they're isolated. Modern basketball is built on feedback loops. Countries improve when their players are constantly tested. And the NBA, and elite European leagues, and systems that expose weaknesses early and force adaptation. Brazil isn't plugged into that loop. For years, Brazilian basketball has remained mostly domestic. Very few players enter top European academies. NCAA pathways are inconsistent. NBA integration slowed dramatically after the early 2000s. Players like Leandro Barbosa, Nene, and Anderson Varejão proved Brazilians could succeed at the highest level, but they never became the start of a pipeline. They were exceptions, and without a steady flow of players testing themselves abroad, Brazil lost something critical. External pressure. When players don't leave early, weaknesses stay hidden. When systems aren't challenged, standards stagnate. When elite competition isn't routine, adaptation never becomes habit. So when Brazil faces top international teams, the gap shows immediately. Not in talent, but in speed of decision-making, in defensive organization, in comfort under pressure. Brazilian players aren't overwhelmed because they're inferior. They're overwhelmed because this level of basketball isn't normal to them. There's also a regional limitation. Unlike Europe, where players face high-level competition every week, Brazil's players encounter elite basketball in short bursts, a qualifier, a tournament, then back to domestic play. It's not enough to change a culture. Countries close gaps when elite competition becomes routine. For Brazil, it's still an event. And as the global game continues to evolve, faster, smarter, more connected, Brazil keeps drifting further from the center. Not because they lack talent, but because they're not developing where the game is actually being defined. Which brings us to the final question. Not whether Brazil can be good again, but whether they're willing to change how they're connected to the basketball world. Brazil isn't bad at basketball because the country lacks ability. They're bad because ability was never organized. For decades, Brazil relied on talent, moments and individual brilliance. When those appeared, the country competed. When they didn't, everything reset. No structure stacked, no pathway stabilized, no identity carried forward. As basketball professionalized globally, Brazil stayed fragmented. The domestic league survived but didn't develop. Youth systems existed but didn't align. Governance changed but didn't compound. And without compounding, progress disappears. Brazil doesn't need miracles to return. They don't need another Oscar Schmidt. They don't need a lucky generation. What they need is something far less glamorous. Structure that lasts. A domestic league tied directly to development. Clear youth pathways that don't vary by region. Long-term coaching continuity, and real integration into elite international environments. Until then, Brazil will keep repeating the same cycle. Enough talent to compete, not enough structure to sustain. Always close, never consistent. Brazil didn't fall behind because the game passed them by. They fell behind because they never built the systems that could keep up. And in modern basketball, talent without direction doesn't lead anywhere. It just keeps starting over.